Kia ora. Welcome to Maxim Institute's Book Club podcast. My name's Tim Wilson, Executive Director of Maxim Institute, and this time we're looking at Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. The moment I heard about this book, I was excited to read it. I love reading. I've been a long-time reader, but this is a book with a special aspect to it. It's not just about reading the books that we get today. It's about reading into our past and the problems and perils associated around that. And so when I said I wanted to do this book, Kieran Madden jumped at the chance. Why were you so excited by it?
Well, Tim, I think I don't, I've got a lot on at the moment at work, and so I don't usually jump at the chance to do more work. But in this case, I was really excited about this book. I'd read some of Jacobs' previous work, How to Think, and he's an incisive thinker, and he's balanced and charitable, and so and eminently reasonable, and I like that kind of man, and so I like what he's written. I was really keen to see what he'd come up with on this topic. I don't necessarily need to be persuaded about how the worth of reading older books. But I was interested in his rationale and where he was coming from. And I also like to sort of wax lyrical about all the things that are wrong with the present age, and he does a lot of that in this book, so it works well.
So an opportunity to grumble, but also when you open a book, given that you are seeking balance and charity, it's not just pages, but in a sense a mirror, because you yourself are balanced and charitable in many respects.
Yeah, stop, Tim. Stop.
Okay, I'll stop now. We'll get to the heart of the matter, which is that we are pressed for time, we are overloaded with information, and we are preoccupied with our current era, or something that Jacobs defines as presentism. Is that right? Was that that's the expression he uses.
Yes.
We believe our era is an apex of human experience, and so we can discard what you might call history. But Jacobs doesn't buy that, does he?
No, and it is that sort of a lot of this book is a critique of the notion of progress, capital P progress, that history is we are becoming more and more enlightened as the years go on, and those who became before us are broadly unenlightened, and therefore have very little to offer, which is part of he writes in the book that this book is actually for... he writes that 98% of people probably won't read this book because they are so stuck in this presentism, and that it's written for 2%, which is quite a minority.
Quite a minority, but Jacobs doesn't really care about the 98%. He really wants to win over the 2% who he believes are going to read this book and who are, I think, put off the prospect of reading deeply into the past because of a particular political worldview, or this preoccupation with the present, and that's I think that's the thing that attracts me to aspects of this book. I'm not 100% sold. If I were to rate, no, I'm not going to tell you what I rate it as, but in terms of how sold I am. But I think he's correct in the fact that we do suffer from an information overload. Information is coming at us from all vectors. So we are actually probably reading less anyway.
Yes.
And the notion that we're preoccupied with our current times means we're mostly perhaps likely to be reading about our times. What he touches on also, which I think is really interesting, is the fragility of the worldviews that we have. When I say we, I'm talking about other people, of course, not balanced, charitable, intelligent people like you and I, Kieran. And the fact that someone will close the covers of a Jane Austen novel because they believe that what they're reading, despite the fact that it was written by a woman, the rank sexist and patriarchal attitudes of that era, which we have now superseded.
Indeed, and this, I just saw in the newspaper yesterday that Enid Blyton and the famous 5 books are, being cancelled. We saw Dr. Seuss cancelled. It's just sort of this sense of any literature currently is being judged by the morals or the values of today, and not, as I think one of the other authors or someone else who's quoted in there, that they're not judged on their own terms. They're not judged based in the world that they're indeed written on. So I think what I think that Jacobs does really well in this book is problem definition around the informational overload, as you said. I think part of why just cancelling or just ignoring problematic ideas of the past, just cancelling books, cancelling people wholesale, is that it keeps us safe in a sense, that because we've got so much information out there, and he uses the term triage. It's sort of like we need to triage what's coming in, and if we can get something out of our mental space, then we'll do it really quickly. But it means we lose the richness and the depth and the potential sort of truths that are sometimes hidden or obscured, but worthwhile in these older books.
And the expression that that Jacobs uses is personal density for what may be construed as a kind of intellectual resilience that's available to us if we do read books that challenge us, if we do read books that don't conform to the political or philosophic dictates of our time. And his thesis, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but his thesis is, if you can read these books and you don't close the covers, but you actually, and I love the way he uses the metaphor later in the book of wrestling with someone, of wrestling with an ancestor, if you like, and the sense is that if you wrestle with them, somehow you're able to increase your own strength, your own ability to accommodate contrary views. Your view, it's not just accommodate contrary views, but it's to look into worlds that you don't really understand, but also you're able to retain what he calls the authentic kernel, which is that moment when an author, and Ian Forster once described literature as a hand reaching out from the past to clasp your hand, and that authentic kernel moment, then if you can put all those together, you're able to build an attitude by which to cope with the information overload, the fragility of worldviews, the uncertainty, the need for triage, the oversaturation.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and I think I love there's a sense that what Jacobs is critiquing here is that we are bringing these books as sort of resources into the present, and saying, how do they hold up into our own terms? And there's a quote in the book that sort of exhorts us to do something different, which is, when we pick up an old novel, we are not bringing them into our world and deciding whether they are enlightened enough to belong here. We are journeying into the novelist's world and taking a look around. In the sense that when you take a look around, you might find this authentic kernel. There might be some truths in here. There might be some things that disgust and revile you, but you don't close the book. You don't make sure that it's cancelled and doesn't exist, because you lose those kernels. And what I really like about this book is some of the metaphors that are used. And the title around breaking bread with the dead. And there's a chapter in the book called Table Fellowship, and I think I really like the idea of viewing authors as being as breaking bread with the authors, as sharing a meal at a table, because it's relational. It's not just this sort of objective resource that you're
not passive.
Correct.
It's a dance in some way, a dance of the emotions and the intellect.
Dancing on the table, yes, potentially. Mixing metaphors, but we might do a bit more of that.
Well, that's after you mix the white wine with the red wine, Kieran.
But it's a sense that we are, and there's another interesting part about the fellowship or the breaking bread, which is a quote from Auden, of we're not necessarily, and this is something that sort of I came to halfway through the book, was that we're not inviting these figures, authors from the past, to our table. We're actually going to visit them at their table and to understand what their world looks like, and understand, meet, engage with them on their own terms. not, as I said before, trying to judge or just bring things into the present where they don't necessarily fit.
What is fascinating for me about this book is that at some point quite early on, Jacob says, guess what? This is a self-help book. This is a book that will make you a better person. It won't, if you follow the rules or some of the guys. He's not a rule person. More some of the guides that I'm laying out here: the ability to engage, the ability to be humble, etc., etc. Which is it's an interesting pose. I actually think it's a bit more than that, because what he's arguing for is reclaiming our culture and our culture's connection to the past. And got to say, Jacobs is extremely well read and is not backwards and coming forwards to let you know how well read he is. Which is you're if we were at table with Jacobs, Kieran, where he would be surrounded by books and they would all be dog-eared copies and he would be reaching for them. I just want to give a quote here from Milan Kundera talking about the necessity of this project to connect ourselves with our literate and philosophic and moral past, even if we now find aspects of it immoral. This character in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting says that, quote, the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation, and I use that generally, us, will begin to forget what it is and what it was. So there's a sense of mission here, that this is not just a personal self-help, you'll become a better person.
Yes.
You're actually attempting to, he's sort of press-ganging us in to the project of rehabilitating our culture by connecting it to our past.
Yes, and I think you mentioned the notion of personal density before, which is one of the sort of central concepts that Jacob's relying on here, and I like that the idea of density as a way of not being blown about by the sort of volatile winds of the day, and he draws on another concept which is sort of connected called temporal bandwidth, and this is that notion of just being able to look back into the past, and to the extent that we can look back into the past, we will be more weighty and less likely to be blown about by those winds. If we're just living in the past, just living in the moment, we're in trouble.
Yeah, and those winds blow, but they blow at many times during human history. So what's really interesting to me is that that he sets up this notion of our era, which is that it's oversaturated, that we're sort of vacillating, we're trying to make time, we're trying to stop time in a way. But then he goes and he talks about the novel that was probably the most it was the bestseller in France in the 18th century. Rousseau's novel,
a romantic piece, if I recall.
A romantic piece, yeah. But what is interesting is that it's a love story, and one of the heroes of the love story is connecting with his beloved, and he's saying that because he's entering the world of leaving the world of their love, and coming into the world of comings and goings and things to do, and sort of like the busyness of it, that he finds he doesn't know which day what he loves. And that's it's really fascinating that this, I know that Jacobs would say, well, this is a particularly modern or contemporary, dilemma, but then he sort of lets the cat out of the bag with this Rousseau novel, and actually says that perhaps this is, my inference was that this might be a human dilemma. So I think this is where I start to perhaps critique Jacobs a bit. That presentism that he's accusing us of, he may well be guilty of in his own book. Now, Kieran, am I being a bit unkind about this very august author?
Well, I'm not sure to what extent is he doing that Tim, how the whole book is around an argument around looking into the past. Obviously, he's writing from a particular time and place, but why? Can you tell me more about that criticism?
Oh, just in the sense that and this is a sort of wider sense of, I wonder if he and this is the danger that someone who is saying, well, we have to look to our history to escape, not to escape, but to fortify ourselves against the toxic present, is that you tend to over-toxify the present and perhaps over fortify the past. And this notion that he's talking about, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fossick around here for these pages because I've got them presented. Yeah, the novel is Julie or the New Eloise. Perhaps I should say that in a French way. Julie or the New Eloise by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what it talks about is, it was the best-selling book of its century, and as the hero is talking about his loss of, I suppose it's a loss of identity. He says, and I'll quote here: "I drift from whim to whim." This is without his love. "I drift from whim to whim, and my tastes being constantly enslaved to opinion, I cannot a single day be sure what I will love the next." Now, this is not necessarily a contemporary dilemma. I would say that it's a human dilemma, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that for the sake of his argument, it fits in the presentism. But I would encourage Jacobs to pull away the scaffolds of argument and admit that this is actually a dilemma that probably we have confronted in different ways in successive generations.
Yes, and I think there's the opposite of the progress narrative is sort of the doom and gloom caricature of the conservative. Everything's just getting worse and worse, and hell in a handbasket and all of that. I think there's probably tendencies in here for that. There are two main ways that we can look at the past that are sort of unbalanced or reductive. One of those is looking at the past in a nostalgic way, in the sense that everything was amazing and that we need to return there.
I'll tell you what, growing up in Whanganui in the 80s, I can promise you it was great.
Yes.
But do I want to go back?
Yes.
Not sure.
You don't? No, all right. There's a quote by a gentleman called L.P. Hartley in
here. Yeah, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.
Correct. You know it, Tim. Well done.
It's the only, to be fair, it's the only part of that. I think I have read that novel, but that's the most famous part, and it's the first two sentences.
It's quotable. Okay, that makes sense. But I didn't know that, but this resonated with me as another way of sort of thinking about this, and as far as looking at sort of not as a tourist, but this idea of different worlds. And I think these worlds are complex, and they're not just better or worse, but there's a richness, and that's why we're trying to get at that sort of notion of the authentic kernel before, that there's some truth in the past that we can find from these books.
Yeah, and that truth is not necessarily connected to the one could argue that there are certain truths that are immutable, no matter what era, and I would say most people would agree with that it is thou shalt not kill. That's fairly, I would say, that's fairly set in stone. Aspects like that are not dependent on the circumstantial arrangement of petty morals that occur around them, and sometimes I think this is Jacob's point, is that people are repelled by the fact that, for example, a woman may be pursued by a man and not be able to exert some choice over the kind of suitor she has in an Austen novel, etc., etc. Whereas what Austen is actually talking about is a social structure and about society and hierarchies as much as romantic relationships, and she's very good on those too. But if people are repelled by that, then they're not going to get to that authentic kernel.
Yes.
And I've got to say, because he used the example of a feminist who perhaps might close Jane Austen because she didn't approve of the construction of social relations or romantic relations. Do you really believe that people are that ideologically driven these days? Is ideology so prevalent? I'm not convinced. Am I being just optimistic?
I think if we categorize this notion of progress or progressivism as an ideology, I think yes. I think that's what Jacobs is pushing up against here. Potentially less and less so around sort of more concrete ideologies of feminism or, those sort of notions.
Oh, so you're separating the idea that there are certain things that we reject for ideological reasons, a sort of generalized ideology, a generalized kind of politeness, quote unquote politeness, as opposed to, say, feminist ideology or an ideology that construes everything in terms of race, etc., etc.
I mean, I think well, I'm just making a distinction between sort of the progressivism or this notion of this understanding of time and progress, moral and, versus some of the more sort of critical theory or ways of looking at race or sex or class. I think they're still definitely influential, but I'd say this idea of progress is the one that's you're asking, is ideology still a thing? And I think progressivism and all of is probably one the king of the isms at the moment.
And as you say that, I also recollect, the 2% for whom this book is for.
Yes,
as that we started out with, and possibly, and these are people who read a lot, who read aggressively and maybe read systematically, perhaps what you might call intellectuals. If you're listening now and nodding your head, you're probably intellectual as well. But those people tend to perhaps certainly to be more aware of ideologies, and they may reject them or they may accept aspects of them that they think are conducive. And so as I think about this, probably my thought was for the general reader, probably not that ideological, but the reader that Jacobs is looking at, is hoping to engage and hoping to help, is probably that 2% that may well be hostage to ideology. Now, I've been a bit critical of Jacobs, but one thing that I really love is his clear love of books and his clear love of reading and his desire to not just read the actual text themselves. And would you, just a quick question, would you recommend this book to other people?
I would recommend it to other people. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to every person. Recommendations are very personal things from where I'm coming from, and you need, it helps to know who the person is before the recommendation. That's just a general principle, but I think this is definitely a broad. It has broad allure.
Yeah, it does.
And I think we could all benefit from the argument, from the fruits of the argument that he's making, which is becoming weightier people from engaging better in the past, more richly in the past. Reading more helps, but this is sort of he's got a book, How to Think. He's got another book, The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distractions. This is kind of his shtick, and I mean, I wasn't surprised to read that this book, the genesis was from a piece in The Guardian that he wrote, and someone said, "Oh, this is good. This could be a book," because it is sort of a lot of the foundational ideas are kind of contained in the introduction and conclusion, and then there's a lot of, as you said, a lot of eclectic and erudite pieces and authors that he quotes throughout, which is part of my sort of.
Can I just jump in here,
please?
Are you saying the middle's a bit soggy?
For me, this could be a limitation on myself rather than the book.
This is you being charitable and balanced,
It
Kieran.
could be a me problem. But there's I find a lot of books these days could have been an essay rather than a 200-page book, sort of filled out a little bit. But it's all, I think because he is so widely read that I'm struggling to, I sometimes struggle to keep up with this reference to a 12th century prince and then a Simone Weil and then it just darts from time to time and place to place. It seems jarring to me at times, but I wonder whether that's I'm questioning whether that's a me thing or an issue with the book.
I think you
maybe yes is the answer, a bit of both.
Well, you've hit on something there that I noticed too, that at times Jacobs is very sedulous in laying out his arguments and very careful, and other times he's just doing donuts in the middle of the road on a Friday night.
He's just having fun.
He's in
his own Jacobian way.
Yes.
He's having fun, and I think we can be left behind
Jacobite?
a bit potentially. Not sure if he's a fan of that, but Yeah, so I mean, if there was one criticism that I'd have of the book, I think that's the main one. It's a little bit soggy in the middle, but I think the foundational arguments are sound, and I would, you asked whether I'd recommend it. I would heartily recommend this to most people.
I would recommend it, and actually I was talking with my father last night on the phone, and I said, we're going to be talking about this book that I've been reading, and my dad loves books. Like he had a study in the manse at 42 Glasgow Street in Whanganui that was lined with books, and so
old ones too.
Yes, definitely old ones. He was the one that insisted that I start reading Greek myths when I was 10 or 11. So that
he is the 2%.
He is the 2% of the 2%. But I immediately thought, oh, Dad, you love books. You'll love this book, even if you won't agree with all of it. I guess the thing that I'm left with, and I do have some other criticisms, and we can possibly go into those, or maybe we don't need to. Is that there is a sense of loving books, of loving reading, and my sadness as I say that is that I believe that that's a love that's not as widely shared as it used to be, that people they don't have the time, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the interest in reading in the same way that a Jacobs would, or that 2% would. And I would like to see the 98% encouraged, stimulated, compelled. Yes, compelled, Kieran. Forced.
No, well.
What? No, okay.
I heard nothing.
No, to read books, because in reading there is a kind of, he is right, that there is a different version of life, a different world, and different opportunities to confront yourself.
I think you mentioned before around part of his argument is instrumental, is that's the self-help part, which is both for, to form weightier people, but also a more discerning, that could not be the right word, but a more discerning culture in the sense of being able to sift about what's good and what's not. What do we keep from the past? What do we discard? And I really liked Jacobs quoted Chesterton saying, and the quote is, "Any man who is cut off from the past and content with the future is a man most unjustly disinherited, and all the more unjustly if he is happy in his lot and is not permitted even to know what he has lost." And so I really like that in the sense of there's a loss here if people are not reading, but we also don't know what we've lost if we're not. It's
a blissful ignorance, isn't it? But it's not blissful, because I think we feel the discontents of that disconnection from what is our inheritance, and that's evident in terms of when we look at those bellwether signals that Jacob summarizes at the beginning in terms of the absolutization of politics, that everything is viewed through the lens of politics. That's something that I'm very aware of, that politics is almost doing our thinking for us. That's why I was interested in the ideology part, because once you buy into an ideology should just be a way of systematizing and hopefully finding coherence in a set of views. But I think too often we allow ideology to do our thinking for us, because we haven't got the time or the ability to attend or the concentration. And that's built by reading these books that tax us so but reward us often when we don't expect.
And I think there is that sense of sort of informational overload, as you're saying it. There's always been impediments to attention. This is not a new thing. This is where you're saying this is a human dilemma, that we don't necessarily focus on the good, the true, and the beautiful, that we are distracted, and
because there's chippies, lollies, and Coca-Cola, and there are
the cultural forms of those,
and beautiful children, and all of those distractions that are part of the non-monastic life.
We spoke before about we'll potentially be a bit critical here. One of the hopeful aspects in the book, I think, was Jacobs cited some of Wendell Berry's work, and I love Wendell Berry. And the ideas that Berry was critical of in this particular essay was looking at this idea of projection and saying, the future, we project into the future. We're saying the future is going to be like this or that. It's a very futurist view of the world. And his critique of that is that it doesn't come at a cost. You're not accountable to anything. You're just projecting.
You're projecting yourself.
Yes.
And that's the inconvenient aspect of the past, is that there are bits of it there that aren't yourself. Whereas when you imagine the future, guess where it comes from? Your tiny little bonds.
Yes, and this is what he says. Jacobs isn't against the future, and that's an interesting thing to make clear here as well. Is that I think he cites Lewis and says, if we could see into the future, we'd be arguing for that too, but we just can't. We only have the past. But we still need to look into the future and think about what is the inheritance that we're going to pass on to our children and their children's children. But as you said, if all we know is today, then our imaginations for the future are not furnished to do that well.
They're less than not furnished. There's no wallpaper on them. There's no glaze. There's no double glazing.
It's a bit ratty.
Yeah, it's not a. I think that the past equips us. Ideally, the past should equip us to inhabit the present, so that we can conceive of a future that is consistent with the truths that we find in both the past and the present, so we can thus import them into the future once we understand them, once we know them. If we shut that door, then they're not going to be able to get through.
And this is that temporal bandwidth notion. And if your temporal bandwidth is wide, if you're going deep and richly into the past, you can do that. And I think to finish off the Berry point, instead of projection, he articulates a notion of promise. So there's projection versus promise. And this kind of stuck out to me as a, again, I really like the notion of table fellowship because it's relational. I like projection is impersonal, you're just projecting, but promise is relational. And so this notion of we are promising into the future, there's something here relational. What are we promising to those who come after us? And so this book's not just about a posture or disposition about the past. It's also saying the way we engage with the past is it's for our future as well, and that's where the bandwidth goes, not just backwards, but forwards too. And hopefully that can work towards a general sort of I use the word weightiness again, something that's weighty.
But I would say it is a judiciously optimistic weightiness.
Yes,
because if you are attaching, it's hopeful. If you're attaching a vision of the future to someone,
yes,
rather than just projecting it on this blank canvas,
yes,
that we just see as
capital H humanity,
capital H humanity, then that's different and that is more personal. And to get back to what is so special about reading, it's that once you open those covers and you start to amble through the pages, it really is just you and the author. Oh, there are characters populating the scenes, and there are descriptions, but it is just you and the author. It is the author. It's almost you completing the promise made by the author to you, even though they didn't know that you were there, and yet it was something that was somehow made for you because you choose to inhabit it, and you become eventually at home there. And that's a metaphor, I think, for Jacob's view of a well-constructed future based on an understood past,
yes, an
expanded present, and a present of depth, and ideally a hopeful future for our children and our children's children.
And I think, it's a richer way of viewing the world, I think, than just being sort of stuck in the present. And consuming whatever there is that's being dished up to us by the algorithms and dished up to us, which the algorithms are driven by us as well, which is sort of the scary part.
It's a feedback loop.
It is, and so that's where it does come down to this sense of the deeper relational view, not just these sort of abstractions of the future. Yeah.
So, do you encourage people to read this book?
I do.
Yeah, I do too.
I do indeed.
I do as well. And I just want to finish with, I suppose, a hymn, if you like, or a hymn of praise to books that is part of this. He's talking about, in the mid-1950s, Robert Moses. Robert Moses was sort of pillar-like figure in New York. He built contemporary New York in many of the large civic projects that are in New York now were built by this singular figure, Robert Moses. He was the most powerful man in New York City. He oversaw the construction of a convention center at Columbus Circle. I'm quoting now from Jacobs, that he called and caused others to call the New York Coliseum. Now, years later, when Robert Caro was writing his biography of Moses, Moses cooperated but would regularly ask of the book scornfully. This is a builder of buildings, of things, of monuments. He would regularly ask of the book scornfully, how long will it last? In a short while it will be yesterday's news, not worthy to be compared to a mighty Colosseum. And late in the year 1999, Caro watched from the window of his office as workers began dismantling the Colosseum, which has since been replaced by the Time Warner Center. Relating this story to a journalist, Caro said, "When they tore it down, I felt something about books."
It's a good point to finish on, and just the eternal power of words, that they stick with us. And in this instance, not just words, but the people that write the words and the worlds that they inhabit as well. And so I think that this book has been encouraging to me and challenging to engage. I'm not one just to shut books because something's offensive, but I think it's been a bit of an encouragement to just open more books and engage with them charitably, generously, and sort of selfishly for my own density.
A much more dense Kieran Madden, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Tim, thank you.